Hi, we continue in 2 Samuel 22 today as the poet, presumably David, as we've been told, is finding himself in deep trouble with death and Sheol all around him, and suddenly, out of a stormy sky, God appears to rescue him. So before we jump into our scene, let's situate where we are. As you can see on the right side of the screen, we've been following this chiasm that shapes the last 4 chapters of the 2 Samuel. If you haven't watched the introductory video to this unit, I encourage you to do so, where I go over some of the evidence for why this unit as a whole is much later in its writing and composition than the rest of Samuel, almost certainly from the earliest, from the time of King Josiah and around the 630s BCE, and perhaps much later. And we'll see the imagery today from the psalm that we see in chapter 22 echoes imagery of Baal, the storm god. And we have to ask ourselves why that would be the image you'd want to put of Yahweh at this point, especially after the first part of the poem that we saw here had so many other images for God. So to understand that, let's look at the structure of our passage. We saw last time this unit up here where the poet, as David, described the distress that he was in, and now we see this chiastic scene here. And I note as we do, it's certainly a nice tight chiasm. As you can see here, the foundations of the heavens trembled and shaked in the first part, and the foundation of the world were uncovered in the last part, the nostrils here and the nostrils there. But we could also note that here in verse 13, out of the brightness before him, coals of fire flame forth, matches what we see here with coals, glowing coals flaming forth from him. So there perhaps is a subchiasm within it, and we don't need to worry about that too much. It's highlighting all this incredible imagery of Yahweh as a sky dragon, as we'll see. So as I was noting in the introductory video and last time, these are just some of the rare words that are in 2 Samuel 22, almost all late in the sense that they're not found in the Torah, some of which is written in the time of exile or after, like Leviticus and certainly Deuteronomy from just before exile, and Genesis from exile, as I've explained in my Genesis series here at Radical Bible. And as you can see, that most of these words here in this column are rarely in the Torah and rarely in the Deuteronomistic history outside of Samuel, which is the books from Deuteronomy all the way through 2 Kings, but often many times in the Psalms. And for our immediate passage, you can see from 8 to 14, I didn't list a lot of words from 10 to 13, although there are some there. So last time I didn't go over the individual words. This time I will. Not just to see how rarely they're used, but to see what their meaning is and how they're shaping this incredible picture of Yahweh who's going to rescue David from his trouble here. In the context of that, I was noting last time all the nature imagery, and especially we're going to see here the imagery of light and dark and fire and smoke and water all together. And that sets up the image here of Yahweh as the storm god. And it's not unique to our passage. In the Psalms, you can see it here in Psalm 104, the bolded part, almost exactly the same as our imagery here, including the specific image of riding on the wings of the wind. You can see on the left side in verse 11. And fire and flame your ministers, and we certainly see the fire and flame back here in verse 9. And the similar image of setting the earth on its foundations, although in our passage, it's not about setting the earth on its foundations, it's about laying bare the foundations. Similarly, in Psalm 68, we can see lift up a song to one who rides on the clouds, and we see the same thing back in Deuteronomy 33, and I noticed last time that Deuteronomy 32 had a number of those same common words that we have in all 3 of the songs that are the pillars of the books of Samuel. Hannah's song back in 1 Samuel 2, David's song of the bow in 2 Samuel 1, and the song we're looking at here in 2 Samuel 22. Jeshurun, if you're wondering, there is a nickname for Israel that's used a few times in the Bible, and we really don't know much more about it, but since it's there and you might wonder, I at least want to mention that. And we also see it in Isaiah, Yahweh riding on a swift cloud and comes to Egypt there to rescue people from Egypt. So that's echoing what we can see here from a couple excerpts from the Baal cycle from the Ugaritic language back in the 13th century BCE. So that's certainly from whenever the David and Solomon story is written. It's certainly from before that and would have been well established in the Canaanite realm. And so we see here one excerpt is, may Baal set his harness in the heavens, may the cloud rider radiate his horns. And we saw horn of salvation in the first verses of our psalm here. And then later in the Baal cycle, we say, may Baal make his rain abundant, may he make his water greatly abundant in a downpour, may give his voice in the clouds, may he flash to the earth lightning. And we see that exact here, the Most High uttered his voice and sent out lightning. So scholars have argued back and forth about whether Yahweh is a replacement of Baal or whether they're understood as different names for the same God. We don't need to negotiate that here, and it's really impossible to know. It's just to say that this imagery is common to the Canaanite imagery of the people around them, and certainly predates the Bible, much like Enuma Elish that's satirized in the primeval history in Genesis, especially in the Tower of Babel story, much predates the Bible. So whether this is trying to suggest that Yahweh, not Baal, is really the rider on the storm, either way, it's not the creator. And I just want to highlight that because the image of God as the creator, Yahweh is the creator of everything, really emerges in exile. It's in Genesis. We see it in so-called second Isaiah, in Isaiah 40 to 55, as well as in Leviticus. But we interestingly don't see it here, despite the fact that it's almost certainly late. So let's put our shape back up, and we'll just jump right into our passage, and I'll move this up a little bit so we can see it as we go. So just starting in verse 8, and there are a number of interesting words here. The New RSV tries to connect the alliteration here with reeled and rocked, and it's actually more assonance in the Hebrew, as you can see it down below. So we can see the phrase Yiragazu ve'agetha ashu, and this word gosh in that form is also the same word as quaked, and I left it translated as quaked, but it's really the same word here, and it is closer to meaning something like reeled, or even potentially quaked or rolled. So it's doubled here. So reeled, yes, reeled, and rocked. And that's the one that could mean shake or quake. And notice it's a similar kind of sounding word there, vetarash here. And as in other words in the verse, it can also mean shake. So various images of rocking and rolling. And the foundations of the heavens, and that's an interesting phrase. One night I think of the heavens or the sky as having foundations. The Brown Driver Briggs lexicon suggests that the word here, Mosadeth, could also be understood as a wall. So something like, as we see in Genesis 1, the rakia, the dome that separates the sky water from the earth water. Perhaps the story doesn't know Genesis and using this word instead to reflect the space between, the barrier between the sky water and the earth water. So that's what's trembling and quaking here, is suggesting that a storm is coming. And perhaps we could think about that as the thunder that precedes the storm. And we see that word here a couple of other times back in 1 Samuel. And quaked here, using the same word as real as we saw. And it's all described as an expression of Yahweh's anger. And that will parallel, as you can see in my note down below, what we see at the beginning of chapter 24 as part of the framework. We did not see the word for anger in the beginning of chapter 21 when there was a famine, but it was implied there from the fact of the famine, and certainly by the end of that story, we saw that Yahweh was placated, not by the sacrifice of Saul's grandchildren, as the Gibeonites had called for, but by Rizpah's incredible nonviolent witness to the dead bodies from spring all the way through fall that allows David to change his mind and gather up all the bones. So throughout this, we see anger. Here, it's not anger at David. It's apparently anger at those who've put David in the corner, although that's never named. So in the face of that anger and the rocking and trembling foundations of the sky, then we see Yahweh, the sky dragon. And I've got this image here, and this is obviously an AI image. I can't imagine why. There seems to be no classic art of Yahweh as a sky dragon. Let's look at some of the amazing details here. Smoke went up from his nostrils, and nostrils is curiously a common word in the Hebrew Bible, as you can see below, 277 times in the Masoretic text, 35 times in the Psalms, so it's not as high a percentage, but it's certainly common there, often as an expression of God's anger. So the smoke going up from the nostrils and devouring fire, or literally eating fire, fire that consumed from the mouth. And if that's not a dragon, I don't know what it is. And then glowing coals flamed forth from him, although we see in verse 13 a little different poetic description. The coals of fire are coming out of the brightness, which is presumably just another way of talking about the fire. And the coals are interestingly describing as flaming forth. That's not usually what you'd think of the coals, maybe flying forth, but here they are flaming forth. So fiery coals and smoke and devouring fire are coming from God's face. It's quite a scene. And with all that happening, God bows the heavens, or it could be read as bending. It's 30 times in the Psalms of 2 and 16, a relatively common word. So these are not listed on my chart because they're not rare, but they're rare in Samuel. Bowed the heavens and came down, perhaps like God coming down on the Tower of Babel story, but that just seemed like an inquiry and a visit, not this stormy approach. and thick darkness under God's feet. And the term for thick darkness here is a different word from the regular darkness we see in verse 12. It's a special word, va'arafel. It's almost a mystical darkness. We see it a number of times. I'll just look at a couple examples. You can see it from Exodus 20. The people stood at a distance while Moses drew near to the thick darkness where God was. And similarly in Deuteronomy, we can see in 5:22 here, these words Yahweh spoke with a loud voice to your whole assembly at the mountain, out of the fire, the cloud, and the thick darkness. So similar theophany there of a storm god, although not that's on the mountain, not in the sky. And the darkness, this thick darkness, which is described as something, mystical, as I was suggesting, something more than regular darkness, under God's feet in the sky. So somehow between the flames and the smoke above, there's darkness below, and the earth somehow below that, if you can keep a picture of that. And notice the word under here is a hidden key word in this section. Sometimes we'll see it explicitly, but sometimes not. And it's 5 times in the chapter. This is highlighting, of course, that Yahweh reigns above, and everything is under. And then we hear the further description, as I say, a ball-like image. He rode on a cherub. And when you picture a cherub, do you picture this little baby like this? Or do you picture this, which is much more like a cherub, as we can see described, whether in the temple description in 1 Kings or in the Mishkan description in Exodus? And you can see in the bold part that it's not just the little baby. He put the cherubim in the innermost part of the house. The wings of the cherubim were spread out, so a wing of one was touching the one wall, and the wing of the other cherub was touching the other wall, like the picture you see. And their other wings touching the center of the house were touching wing to wing. Similarly, in the Mishkan, which is described to be in this box, but not in a building, the cherubim shall spread out their wings above, overshadowing the mercy seat with their wings, and they shall face to one another. The faces of the cherubim shall be turned toward the mercy seat. And as I argued in my book, Come Out My People, the Exodus story in the Mishkan is a religion of creation counter story to the religion of empire, temple, and the enthronement ritual there in 1 Kings. We'll get to that in my 1 Kings series. So that's what's being named here, that kind of cherub, something powerful and dramatic like that, but not contained in the temple and not contained in the Mishkan, but God riding it in the sky, and was seen on the wings of the wind. And as I noted in the rider on the storm chart there, a cloud rider, we can see that was also in Psalm 104. And we see wings back in 1 Samuel 24:5, but not wings of the wind. That's an interesting image because it suggests the wind is something like a bird. And that would comply with something like the Spirit, like a dove, as we see, for example, in Luke's Gospel, in the baptism story of Jesus. But we don't know if Luke has anything like wings of the wind, has his image there, but it is Ruach here, so it could be wings of the Spirit as well, and that might be something behind the image of the dove. But the dove is very gentle, and this image here is hardly gentle. And we're not done yet. Riding on the cherub with the smoke and fire, now make regular darkness, Hoshek, and we see it again in verse 29, and we've seen it a couple of times, 11 times in the Psalms out of 80, and of course, out of which God creates in Genesis 1:2. So he made darkness around him like a canopy. Canopy is a little misleading because it suggests something from above here. The word saviv here, used 338 times, really means like an encircling, so something wrapped around. So he's wrapped around in darkness, thick clouds and a gathering of water. So what we're supposed to see there is God is in a big dark cloud. And we're going to see what comes out of that in a moment. But interestingly, the word for thick cloud is sukkoth, for booth. And so we could translate that more literally. He made darkness around him like a circular booth, in this gigantic spherical booth, described interestingly as a gathering of water. Shathroth Mayim here, and Shathroth only here in the Masoretic text, so it's hard to know exactly what it means. But it seems like it's what we might call an atmospheric river, a big, dark, wet cloud. And out of the brightness before him, which is not the same as the lightning, that's the fire and coals that we can see here. And the word for brightness here, menagah, is only one other time in the Torah, and we see in chapter 23 in the paired psalm, although it's not a psalm word. 19 times in the Masoretic text, as I noted, presumably referring to the fire from the mouth. And then coals of fire flame forth, matching those from verse 9. And then we get the lightning and thunder. And as you can see from my note below, the Hebrew word order that's translated here in the NORSV is immediately chiastic. So thundered, matching sound, and from heaven, and Yahweh and Most High. So the immediate verse is its own little chiasm. Lord Yahweh thundered from the sky. The Most High uttered his voice, the thunder being God's voice, and sent out arrows, which are lightning. The word for arrows here, hats, is only in 1 Samuel 17:7, and the scene in 1 Samuel 20, where Jonathan and David used the arrows as a kind of signal to let them know what Saul's will is about David. If you've been following my series, you know what happened there. He sent out arrows and scattered them, lightning, and routed them, although it doesn't have to be translated that way. It is doubled. And as my note below has from the Brown Driver Briggs lexicon, it refers to noisy movement, not an outcome. So to the extent that we get the image here of it's routing his enemies, that's not the real image here. It's really of a noisy movement toward them. It's combining the thunder and everything else of the storm that's happening. And it's such a powerful storm, there seemed to be such wind that it reveals the channels of the sea. And the word for channels here is like a riverbed. It's something that water flows through a number of times. It's 7 times in Ezekiel and 18 times in the Masoretic text. And so it seems to be something like what we see in Exodus, and the wind blowing the reed sea so the Israelites can walk on dry land, although that's not referenced here explicitly. And this is the only time it's in the Torah, so we don't see this word in Exodus. So the channels of the sea were seen, and the foundations of the world here. Again, Mosedeth, as we saw in verse 8, forming the chiastic parallel. But here a very unusual word, tevel, for world. It's only one other time in the books of Samuel, and it's not in the Torah or the Deuteronomistic history anywhere else. It's 9 times in Isaiah and 15 times in the Psalms of 36 times. But here it's matching the foundations of the sky. And I noticed yet again, it's not saying that God made these. This is not a creator psalm, that God set the foundations of the world, but this is a powerful sky God who can reveal the foundations with a powerful wind that blows the water away and reveals the bare earth, laid bare at the rebuke of Yahweh here. And the word for rebuke here, ge'ara, not elsewhere in the Torah or the Deuteronomistic history, 4 times in the Psalms of 15. At the blast of the breath of his nostrils. And the word for breath here is not the same as what we saw earlier for the wind, which is ruah, or could be also as breath, as we see in Genesis 2:7. Here it's minishmath, only here in Samuel, although it is in Genesis 2:7 there, is what God creates with. It's not the same as ruach there. And so that's this incredible image of the powerful storm god Yahweh who's on David's side. But we have to pause before we continue to say, where have we seen anything like this in the books of Samuel? Where is David, if it is getting this image? We've seen nothing, no sense of Yahweh as a storm god throughout. We've seen God simply as someone one consults or one who gives judgment, like in the Uriah situation, but not anyone who's ever acting in the natural world in this way, especially in a way that interacts with the world of empire down on the ground. So it's a very different image, and we'll see what it is that the reason for this whole powerful image is in the next unit of the psalm. We'll see you for that next time. Bye-bye.